Hello, everybody, and welcome to another episode of your Bish Therapist podcast. I am your host, Melissa Reich, your Bish Therapist, a real life therapist turned pop culture aficionado, serving clinical interpretations and hot takes on all things pop culture. And today's episode is going to be a two-parter. First, I'm going to talk about Summer House Reunion Part 2. Specifically, I'm going to talk about the extended scene where Lindsay talks about Carl's use of mushrooms. I'm going to give my thoughts on the whole reunion, but that specifically talking about sobriety, recovery, all of that. And then the second part of this podcast, I am going to talk about, for those of you who have watched Real Housewives of Beverly Hills when Lisa Rinna was on, this will ring a bell for you. But Lisa Rinna's mother, Lois, before Lisa was born, Lois was attacked by a serial killer. She was the first victim, and she was the reason that he initially went to jail. But of course, he got out and murdered a whole bunch more people because, justice, right? So I was watching, one of my shows that I watched. People who have listened to this for a while know that I have this not obsession, but I feel very psychologically fascinated by a couple of things. And one of them is serial killers. Specifically, I'm fascinated by psychopathology. And, and by the way, what psychopathology is, I'll explain a little bit of that, talk a little bit about that. But I was watching one of my shows and Lisa Rinna pops up and they show a clip of Real Housewives of Beverly Hills. And I thought, oh my gosh, I remember that. Because when Lois, may she rest, Lois has passed, unfortunately, but when she was alive, she told her story on Real Housewives of Beverly Hills. So I just thought, my goodness, what a interesting intersection of my interests that I completely forgot about until I was watching this show. So first, I'm going to talk about Summer House, then I'm going to talk about that. But before I get started, I want to do, I need to make a correction of my last podcast. So my last podcast, I talked about Captain Lee and Carl and all of that. And so I incorrectly made some comments about how Captain Lee was in the program. He is not in the program. So first of all, let me apologize. I definitely am not always right. I sometimes speak out of, I think that I know maybe what I'm saying and I don't. And so I just want to own that and apologize for that misinformation. So the true story is that Captain Lee is such an advocate for addiction and recovery because he lost his son Josh to a very long battle with opioid addiction. His son Josh was an addict for over 20 years. He passed away due to the disease of addiction. Captain Lee talked about, at first they called it an accidental overdose, but he's changed his language around it because of course, his son didn't mean to harm himself, but it wasn't accidental. It was, he died from the disease of addiction. And so I just wanted to say that because I think, Captain Lee has done a lot of work to advocate and make changes in, pharmacology and things like that because of the loss of his son. And so Carl and Captain Lee, they obviously, it's obvious to me now remembering that. And by the way, I do want to take a moment to thank all of you amazing people for, when I misspeak, you're so kind and lovely. You let me know, but in really lovely, appropriate ways. And I just appreciate that because, I always say I'm not perfect. I'm not always right. I'm human and I do make mistakes. So thank you for, those kind, those kind reminders. But, so I think that Captain Lee, my interpretation is that because he lost his son to addiction, he looked at Carl, kind of maybe projected some of that stuff onto Carl, or at the very least, this is the connection between he and Carl. Carl's a young guy. Captain Lee loses his son Josh to addiction. He, Captain Lee, I think, took this as the opportunity to take Carl not under his wing, but just to try to do something with his grief, because grief is so painful, and it's so, oh God, it feels so crushing. And so for a lot of folks who are grieving, the loss of a child, especially due to the disease of addiction, I think he's just trying to do all this good with his grief, speak about addiction, make changes, do the work, and really help people, who are in recovery. So anyway, I just wanted to make that correction and thank people for kindly letting me know that. And I felt it was good to start with this anyway, because, I'm going to be talking about, let me roll this right into the deleted scene, why? My first question is why? And for people who don't know what I'm talking about, Bravo shared on, what they aired. They also aired an uncensored and extended version of Summer House Reunion Part 2 on Peacock. So for those of you who don't know, Peacock is basically an extension, in my opinion, of Bravo, in that they take the housewives reunions, what have you, and then they air them on Peacock unedited so you can hear the cursing, and then there are often extra scenes that we don't get to see. And so it's always interesting to me when I think about, well, why didn't we get to see this extra scene? So for those of you who didn't see it, I'm going to explain. And please pardon my voice a little bit. My allergies are atrocious. In Northeast PA right now, they are, everything's blooming. It's gorgeous, but my throat has not enjoyed it. So the deleted scene was that Lindsay calls out Carl they were going to some sort of music, like a concert or like I don't know what people do out there, concert, Coachella. I have no idea what it was. It was some sort of musical event. And Carl suggested that they take mushrooms before the festival. And that's the word I'm looking for, by the way, festival. That's the other thing. People are like, oh, you're so articulate. But sometimes when I'm recording myself, I always get nerves, and I'm talking and I'm looking at myself, and it's just so weird. And sometimes I just lose my words. So thank you for your patience on that. But she calls Carl out about this mushroom use before the festival. And I'm here to just talk about that, because this extended scene came off the heels of her starting to talk about the cocaine Carl gate and why she said this, and, all of her reasoning and all of that. So let's set the scene. She's talking about how she feels, she's coming back in the house. She doesn't know where she stands with the girls, which is, by the way, more than fair. She knows that right now her only ally in the house is her fiance, Carl, who she clearly can't stand, and they're obviously not getting along. Like, what we have found out now is that there was so much toxic, aggressive, unhealthy stuff going on in their relationship, and Carl was like, well, I wanted to protect it. Why? Like, that's not good. I mean, I think we all do that to an extent, right? If a partner or someone does something that, we know someone's going to judge. If we love that person, we want to maintain our relationship. We'll maybe hide certain things. But, everyone who's listened to this for a long time knows that, and I'm going to repeat this a million times, secrets keep us sick. And especially when you're in recovery, holding deep secrets about the truth of your relationship, for me, is very concerning for Carl in his recovery, if I'm being honest. So Lindsay says, I was so on edge, and because I was on edge, I drank too much. And when we were in the car, she wanted empathy. And here's the irony. It sounded like she wanted softness from Carl. I mean, she wouldn't have dared said that, but it sounds like she wanted some softness from Carl, some sweet validation, supportive backup. She felt like she didn't get that. And so she just escalated to the point that, she ended up, weaponizing Carl's sobriety. She 1,000% did that. In my opinion, one of the things that Lindsay struggles with is that she feels so strongly about things that she feels those feelings are facts. But as I've said probably too many times on this podcast, is that feelings are not facts. Our feelings are irrational. And sometimes trauma survivors or people who, have varied levels of trauma, right? Our brains can get hijacked, especially people with complex PTSD, some mental health issues. And I know this because not only have I seen it in clients, but I've experienced it with myself, where the person you are hearing right now talking to you, sometimes when my brain gets hijacked, she's gone. Like, I can look at myself and be like, Melissa, what is going on, girl? It feels like I'm talking to a totally different person or trying to, validate a totally different person. It's a wild experience. And for people who know what I'm talking about, you're nodding your heads vigorously. You're like, yes, I get it. So I think that Lindsay, sometimes her brain gets hijacked. And the problem is she acts as if her feelings are 100% fact. And that's just not how it is. So she escalated because she felt that Carl wasn't giving her the softness, the support, the validation that she was looking for. And she just kept amping it up. Now, I have said this from the beginning, is that scene with her and Carl and her refusing to take accountability for that, in my opinion, is enough to rupture a relationship beyond repair. I think all the stuff that happened after that was just kind of icing on the cake, so to speak. But that in and of itself, for me, is enough to say, wow, that's a huge thing. For people who their sobriety is a literal life or death situation. And again, people who have experienced this with themselves, with a loved one, worked in the field, etc. People with a disease of addiction typically are wonderful, amazing people who are self-medicating, and they're in so much pain. They don't know what to do with that. They're afraid of it. They want to avoid it. A million things, right? I have a ton of compassion for that. So, but Carl also has to take accountability of his part in this, right? So, because as you all know, I'm team everybody plays a role. And so cut to this deleted scene. So what I said at the beginning of this is why? Why was the scene deleted? It felt to me that there were some, and listen, I'm no Lindsay stan, right? I can appreciate Lindsay. The thing about me is I can appreciate people mostly, except for Jax. There's very little I can appreciate about Jax. I'm going to be honest. But most people on Bravo, on TV, are human beings who are flawed, and I can appreciate their humanity and have a lot of empathy from them. But what Lindsay did here was, so essentially Lindsay said, everyone at the reunion really was so hard on her, which I thought was a little bit unfair. It really seemed to be a gang up on Lindsay, which I thought was wild. Even though I'm not a Lindsay stan by any means, it just felt a little bit unbalanced and a little bit unfair. And what I was getting to is it felt like there are some really serious misogynistic undertones happening within the Bravoverse. Case in point is, why wasn't Kyle called out on his egregious, verbally abusive behavior of Amanda? Why was Carl getting, it seemed to me, a pass for things that he needs to be accountable for? Why was this all on Lindsay? And, Kyle talked to Lindsay throughout the reunion in such a wildly aggressive way. In my opinion, that was not talked about. It just seems that Andy and production picked a side. That's what it seemed to me. And the problem with that, I get it, because I always say, doing what I do, I can't always be impartial because I'm a human being and I have my own thoughts, feelings, behaviors, opinions. I have my own background that makes me see things through a certain lens. So just because I'm a therapist doesn't mean I see things exactly right or exactly as they are all the time. I have that humanity part of me that the lens can shift. So Andy, of course, is going to have that, right? He talked about, he watches Summer House. He watches it as a fan. And I think that that's the dangerous thing for me, is if I'm a fan of a show and then I'm also somebody's boss and I'm leading a reunion, it doesn't give a very impartial view. It can give these very stacked viewpoints, and that's what I feel like we saw at the reunion. Now, Lindsay made missteps, Carl made missteps, but so Lindsay essentially apologizes for calling him Cocaine Carl. Carl did say to her, I almost truly died. He lost his brother to this disease. So when he says I almost died from this, that needs to be taken seriously, truly. And so she apologizes for that. But then we go to this deleted scene where right after she apologizes for it, well, first of all, she walked back that apology and said she should have used more delicate words. And it's like, nah, man, you just apologized and then completely walked it back. And now it seems like your apology, like the apologies that are like, I'm sorry, but that is not an apology. That is protection of ego. And so I feel Lindsay did the I'm sorry, but look at this information. Now, that information, I understand why she said it, and I do feel it is pertinent to the situation. So I'm going to talk about this extended scene. So Lindsay says her and Carl were going to a festival. They took mushrooms, and this was shortly before the Cocaine Carl incident. So again, she's saying, I'm sorry, I shouldn't have done that. And then she's doubling down and she's doing it again. However, I understand why she did that, because she's feeling like, well, I need to explain myself, to explain why I thought that night when I called him Cocaine Carl, he was on something else. So it doesn't totally jive to me, because if you thought he was on mushroom, like she was saying that he's telling everyone he's sober, but he's not really sober, right? And so this begs the question of sobriety. What does that mean? So I'm going to talk about that in a minute. Sobriety is not black and white. There's things that work in theory and in practice. And so in theory, I'm going to give you an example. When I was in graduate school, there were hard and fast rules that you learn about being a therapist. One is not accepting gifts, and there's good reasons for that, and it's important, and all these things. There's black and white things that you learn. But in theory, that makes sense. But in practice, that doesn't always make sense. So for example, when I worked with kids and I would end with them, one time I had this, oh gosh, I adored her, this client who made me a board game based on what I taught her about coping strategies. I still have it to this day. It was one of the most meaningful things in the world. But in theory, my school taught me you shouldn't have accepted that. So in practice, could you imagine if I was like, nah, man, this doesn't work? And I know it's not what you say, but how you say it. But it's one of those things that I just share as a perspective, because I think people who don't have a clinical background, sometimes it can seem very black and white. But in clinical practice, there's a lot of gray, and that's just what I'm trying to express. So what happened was Carl took mushrooms. They went to this music festival, and when Lindsay called him on it to kind of explain herself, because she really was getting it from every single person at that reunion except for Gabby. And I didn't feel that was totally fair, but especially how the girls all rallied around her. And then at the reunion, it was like everyone was kind of like against her. And I'm like, well, where did all that support go? So it was just wild for me to watch. The most important thing from this deleted scene that I'm going to tell you right now is Carl's reaction. So forget what Lindsay said, forget why she said it, forget that it was weaponizing, forget that she did do it to try to explain it herself. Like, there's a million reasons, I get all that. To me, what was interesting was Carl's reaction. Carl reacted very embarrassed. He appeared extremely ashamed, and he immediately said, "We microdosed." And, explained himself. He said, well, we microdosed and I told you it was never going to happen again, and blah, blah, blah. So here's what concerns me the most is Carl's reaction, because saying that we microdosed, that is denial and minimization. Well, not denial. Sorry, scratch that. It's severe minimization of like, well, I took drugs, but it doesn't really count. Okay, number one. Number two, the way that he appeared tells me that he had some shame and guilt about it and maybe had not been honest with people about that. So I understand where Lindsay's coming from in terms of he's saying that he's sober. He's making sobriety his brand, or wants to make it his brand, but he's using marijuana. He's microdosing mushrooms. And I'm going to guess, I don't know, that maybe there were some other things that they're not mentioning, or Lindsay's not mentioning. I think there were NDA signed. I'm pretty sure that there were between the two of them. So I just get the sense that there's more to this story, that they both have dirt on each other and it makes them both look bad. So I am going to guess that there's things that happen behind the scene. So here's my frustration with this with Carl. I feel that Carl is trying to make sobriety his brand, right? He's looking for a career. He's looking to build a business, which, I get that. Lindsay was after him to do that all summer. And I feel that he is, in the program, he talks about he has a sponsor, he goes to meetings, he's honest with his sponsor about his marijuana use, but is he honest with his sponsor about the other things that he's done? And to me, when it comes to recovery, the most important factor is radical honesty. Radical honesty. That's it. Are you being honest with yourself and other people about the things that you're doing? Because the one thing I can tell you for sure about addiction is it thrives in dishonesty and secrecy. It thrives. Shame, secrecy, minimization, all of that. That is how addiction thrives. So for me, Carl's reaction was very concerning. And if he had said, for example, yeah, we totally did that. I talked to my sponsor about it. It was something I realized I shouldn't have done. And, I never want to do it, whatever it was, but that wasn't his reaction. I think in general is that, again, these two people, it's more interesting to me as a therapist to look at why were they attracted to each other in the first place? Because they didn't really like each other very much, or it seemed like they didn't have a lot of fun together. They were just both so miserable and having these huge, huge issues. Which again, of course, like Andy went so hard against Lindsay. And so what I wrote on Instagram is that Lindsay eventually admitted that Carl made the best decision for both of them, but she maintained feeling blindsided. And so Andy's big question was, well, how were you blindsided? So here's my honest view on this. Lindsay felt blindsided, but she clearly wasn't. Anybody who watched the season, so production, the fans, the rest of the cast, everyone could tell this is a disaster. You guys can't get married. Like, it is so obvious. But when you're in it, it's hard to see the forest for the trees, right? When you're in it. And so I understand what Lindsay's saying, but the fact is that she needs to focus on more on why on earth were you going to stay in a relationship that was so toxic and so unhealthy just because you feel that relationships aren't all supposed to be puppies and rainbows and butterflies, which is what she always says. Yes, that's true, but relationships shouldn't be toxic waste. They shouldn't make you feel bad. They shouldn't make you have to lock yourself in a room. Like, if you're locking yourself in a room during an argument with a partner, that is a couple standard deviations above the norm for unhealthy or just like what a relationship is. That's not healthy. That's not normal. Okay. So I think that she just can't, she has the right to feel that he doing it on, that Carl breaking up with her on camera was a huge, was a problem for her. She has every right to feel that. She does. I think that my interpretation is that Carl was a good Bravo employee by filming it, but maybe he wasn't a good friend or fiance. I think that's, to me, what this boils down to. All of the semantics about how did it end, why did it end, blindsided, not blindsided, that to me is just a distraction from the fact that it needed to end no matter how it ended. So Lindsay's allowed to feel how she feels. Carl's allowed to feel how he feels, but it needed to end, period, end of sentence, full stop. And if Lindsay wasn't going to do it, thank goodness Carl did. And again, did he have to do it on camera? No, but he was being a good Bravo employee, doing his job. They got engaged on camera. But Lindsay also has had the right to want a more private discussion. That's it. So I think that Andy pushing about all this, right? He clearly has a stake in the game in terms of the show and production. And like, imagine if this wasn't filmed, how the ratings would have suffered, or, ultimately this is a business, people. This is a business, and Andy is in that business. And so sometimes I do think that Andy's multiple roles with these different Bravo Lebs certainly can present a problem. In psychology, there are relationships where, they give you examples about if you're in a small town and you're a therapist, but you're also a vet, or you're a therapist, but you're also a doctor, or whatever. There are some towns, some small areas where they have people who serve a lot of roles, like in smaller, Alaskan, whatever it is, areas. In regular society, we don't see this a lot because these relationships, they're called dual relationships. And I should have mentioned that. I'm so sorry. Dual relationships, which are, you have one role with somebody, but you also play another. And so for Andy to essentially be a boss, but also a fan and hosting a reunion, sometimes that's a dual relationship that makes him look very biased. And I think he was very biased at this reunion. And in my opinion, I said this on one of my reels and people wanted to know more of what that meant. I believe that Andy is projecting some of his stuff onto Lindsay. And I'll explain what I mean by that. So Andy has of late been accused by a lot of women in the Bravoverse, Bethany, Leah, a couple of other women. He's been accused of what he feels, is adamantly incorrect. What they're saying that he's done, the misogyny and the way he's treated people and all these things, he is denying it categorically. And obviously, as a human, this is going to impact him. I know that it is. And to me, in this reunion, we see how, in my opinion, this has impacted Andy, because I think he was completely blind to Carl's stuff and over-identified with Carl, like Lindsay, as a woman in the Bravo sphere, she's making accusations. These accusations aren't fair to Carl. I think that's him over-identifying. That's my opinion. I'm not saying that's correct. That is my opinion and my clinical intuition of why Andy was so wildly skewed at the reunion. That's my thought on that. To wrap up Lindsay and Carl. Lindsay, I feel like Lindsay, here's the thing. She struggles to take accountability. She struggles to understand her role in things. And I think that my concern for Lindsay is in her next relationship, which she's already in one. It's clearly serious. She has said at the reunion that it's serious. And now we're seeing social media rumors that, you know, they're pregnant and all of these things. So my real concern is that Lindsay would be doing a great disservice to herself to say, this was all Carl. I was blindsided. Let me not work on anything. Just get into this new relationship and let me hope that these patterns don't repeat. Lindsay could be dating the most kind, meek person in the world, but her relationship issues are still going to get played out. We are destined to repeat unhealthy patterns that we aren't willing to address and look at, period. And she played a huge role in this, as did Carl. Now, I think Carl he says the right things on the outside, but I get the sense that there is more denial and minimization, and there's like an underbelly that maybe we don't get to see as much. Lindsay's stuff is loud, it's out there. Carl's, I think, is more hidden. So trust me, there's a reason that they were attracted to each other. Okay. Carl's not innocent in any of this either. He's got to look at, why am I attracted to this chaos? Because a lot of people in recovery, when they, there's a reason you're not supposed to date for a year, because you're supposed to find out who you are, get to know yourself. And the main reason is that when you're newly in recovery, it's so easy to behaviorally repeat similar patterns of chaos without using a substance. So people will get into a relationship and they'll start using that relationship like they used cocaine. And so I think Carl's really got to look at that. And obviously that is a unique perspective from me that, a regular Bravo person isn't going to be able to talk about, but that's just what I personally see. The last thing that I'm going to say is it was wild to me how realizing, because I didn't realize this, when they were talking about the whole job thing, I don't sometimes understand how that world works, but Lindsay and Carl had the same job. They had the same job. They're on the show. They are content or influencers or whatever you want to call them. They do brand deals, blah, blah, blah. So Lindsay was yelling at Carl all summer about they had the same job. I was so confused about that. And so my last thing that I'll say here is I think that Lindsay wanted to be a Stepford wife while yelling all season about how she didn't want that. And the thing is, it's okay if Lindsay wants to be taken care of and have someone who has money to take care of her and her child so that she doesn't have to work. That's fine. But it's wild to go into a partnership where you're assuming things are 50-50. And then all of a sudden before the wedding, she's like, well, you need to do better at this. And it's not like he was making no money. They both were making money from the show. So I just thought that was also like a really interesting piece that I wanted to comment on. Now before we go on to Lois Rinna, I do want to talk about a couple of things. I think I want to talk about West and Sierra. I just want to do a snippet of this. I feel like we saw West apologize and take accountability for his actions. His demeanor to me appeared really guarded and flat. So in psychology, there's something called affect, and your affect is how your emotions match your expression of your emotions. So how you appear on the outside. And I feel like West had sort of this very flat affect where it was like hard to understand what he was experiencing. He just like seemed like a little kid who was in trouble, and he seemed to struggle to express emotions. But when I saw his like giant sweat stains, it was clear to me that he was having physiological reactions to stress. And so it was a good reminder to me that, like, listen, West is human. He's not a monster. I don't agree with what he did with Sierra at all. She was super intentional. He ignored that. But I think there's sometimes where people don't express emotions, but it doesn't mean that they don't feel them. So I just wanted to kind of talk about that. Also, Jesse talked about, as a man, you don't want to show emotion. I had a contract with myself that I wouldn't cry on national TV. And so here's what I want to say about this piece too, because Jesse was like having a cancer scare, which, as someone who's had cancer twice, I live with a chronic incurable cancer and I have PTSD and I know exactly what this is like. I just feel like societally, men are conditioned with toxic ideas of masculinity and intense shame around emoting. In my opinion, it's a form of generational trauma that's perpetuated in a lot of family systems. Like I talked about before, years ago, men went to war, they came back, and they had to just pretend that they weren't traumatized because otherwise they'd be accused of being gay, which also like is not an insult, but don't get me started on that. So I just think that men's mental health has taken such a spotlight recently, and I'm just grateful for that because men have feelings. They are valid. They deserve to be expressed and attended to. And quite frankly, that the men that you see that are really angry and miserable, it's just because they won't feel their shit. They don't want to feel their stuff. They hold themselves to this wild standard that because they have a penis and testicles, that they somehow are immune from having an emotion. And I'm just like, how did we get here as a society? Like, I needed to be born way back then so that I could shout from the rooftops that this is insanity. And if everyone just felt their feelings, I think we'd all be much happier. But that's my soapbox moment for the day. Okay, now the last thing I'm going to talk about is Kyle and Amanda, because Kyle really irritated me during this reunion, and I'm going to tell you why. He and Carl are, in my opinion, very codependent. So Kyle, how I talked about Andy projecting, well, I also think Kyle projects. I think Kyle projects his stuff onto Lindsay because he and Lindsay are very similar. They both get intoxicated, act in ways that are not appropriate, say things that are wildly inappropriate, get angry, act out, hurt people's feelings. But Kyle is going to like be hard on Lindsay about that. It's like, bro, look in the mirror, look at yourself. So Kyle is projecting his stuff onto Lindsay, and that's why he's being hard on her. He really needs to be harder on himself and hold himself to the level he's holding Lindsay. And I think that, a good friend kindly and respectfully call someone on their shit. And Kyle just like being an echo chamber for Carl is not healthy at all, in my opinion. And I think Carl needs to look at that relationship too. He has codependent relationships for sure. And that's a huge part of recovery, is learning to have relationships that are not codependent in recovery. And it's hard, but it's a part of the deal. So Amanda talked about, I was on the road to becoming depressed. Let me read this. Amanda said, I was on the road to becoming very depressed. I was checked out. I was quiet. It just sometimes comes over you. It runs in my family. I was struggling more than I realized. I can see how he felt lonely because I felt lonely too. So for me, there are a couple major pieces here. I am so freaking proud of Amanda for coming forward and talking about this in this way, because when she talked about, she just touched on it, but it runs in my family. And I think that sometimes when we have clinical depression that is in our family, there is epigenetic evidence. I talk about epigenetics a lot. There is evidence to support that when we have parents who have mental health issues, not only are there genetic connections to that, but there are also psychological and behavioral connections. So if you grow up with a parent who is clinically depressed, that is going to impact you, period, no matter if you have the genetic predisposition for clinical depression or not, right? So that informs how we see ourselves and the world and how we respond. Gene Wilder, I just watched something on Netflix about how he was told, his mother had health issues, and he was told, don't argue with your mother because you might kill her. Well, holy moly, that is not something you'd say to a child, and that is absolutely going to affect their ability to feel emotions, express emotions, and things like that. And so it's just a small example, but I feel that, depression is an invisible illness and it has a lot of stigma still. So I think Amanda did what most people do, which I do too, which is called masking. And masking is actions or coping strategies to conceal genuine thoughts, feelings, or emotions. And so I'm an example of someone who, I'm doing a podcast today. I'm very tired. I don't feel well. You wouldn't have known that unless I said it. You wouldn't have known that because I'm still articulate. I'm still, smile and happy and joyful because I am just that kind of person, but it doesn't mean that I am not struggling. And so I think that when you mask, people appear higher functioning than they truly are, which leads to increased isolation and despair. And it's a vicious cycle with very deadly, serious consequences. Because after, if you just continue to feel so alone, and then, that's how suicidal thoughts happen. So what I was so proud of Amanda for is she literally, with her whole chest, exclaimed, antidepressants are amazing. She was like, everyone should do drugs, meaning psychotropic medications. And I was just so happy she said this with her whole chest because psychotropic medication is life-saving. I'm on Lexapro. I will say that any chance I get. And listen, there was a time where I wouldn't have admitted that because I was probably embarrassed. There is some bullshit thinking that to be a therapist, you can't have your own stuff. But in fact, my own stuff has made me, in my opinion, a great therapist. It's made me have an understanding personally and professionally, and it gives me a perspective that has truly helped people. So how is that bad? I don't know. But I will shout from the rooftops for other providers who are listening to this. If you are in therapy, you're a therapist in therapy, bravo. Therapists need therapists too. And in fact, I would argue that therapists need therapists to be the best therapists they can be because we all have unconscious processes that get played out. Therapists are just like everybody else. In fact, they go into the field for a very specific reason, but I digress. So research shows that the best treatment for clinical depression is a combination of therapy and medication. However, all humans are unique, and I always say this, there's not a one size fits all approach. Sometimes medication works for people, sometimes it doesn't. For me, it has been life-saving. But kudos to Amanda for using her resources to get well and to give stigma the middle finger on the way out. I was just so proud of her. So proud of her. But also, the last thing I'm going to say here, which made me so angry about Kyle, is okay, so he knows about her depression. He says that. So why was it not discussed how he had his little king baby temper tantrum and he called her lazy? So you know that your wife is clinically depressed and she's struggling, and you're going to call her lazy on national television? Bro, that's wild. That is wild. And so this is what frustrated me about Andy. Why was that not brought up? Lindsay, everyone went so hard for Lindsay, but where was Kyle's stuff? Where was, hey, Kyle, we watched you say the most atrocious things about your wife who was experiencing clinical depression, which you knew, and you just said the nastiest, wildest stuff about her. Where was that? I just feel so frustrated and annoyed about that. So I guess, listen, TBD, because at the end of reunions, what I think is so funny, this reunion just totally fizzled out. And everyone, I get the sense at the end of a reunion that it is well, hey, does everyone want to keep their jobs? And so Andy goes around to people and it's so do you think you could work with them in the future? And everyone's just yeah, we can work with each other. It's okay. And I get it. Everybody wants to keep their jobs, but it was a very weird fizzled out ending to a very intense season. And I feel like we should have gotten a part 3. I wanted to hear Kyle have his feet held to the fire, but apparently there was different expectations for different people on that cast, which annoys me. So bloop, that's all I'm going to say there. Okay. Now let's go on to Lois Rinna and the Trailside Killer. Okay, so this is how this authentically came up for me. I watch any serial killer show, any show about serial killers on Investigation Discovery. I watch it. Anything I can get my hands on, well, any channel, any, like, Netflix, whatever. But specifically, Investigation Discovery has a show. It's called Very Scary People. Side note, Donnie Wahlberg is like the host of it. And at first I was like, what? Why is he hosting this? It just seems such an odd choice, but honestly, it's a really good show. They feature some of the most prolific serial killers throughout our history: Jim Jones, the trailside killer David Carpenter, Charles Manson, and like a bunch of other people. So if you're interested, look that up. They tell the story in two parts. So the first part is like kind of what happened, and then the second part is like the consequence to what happens after they're caught. It's just a very satisfying series. And so I'm sitting here on like a random afternoon, chilling, watching my shows, and all of a sudden I see Lisa Rinna, and it shows a flashback to the Real Housewives of Beverly Hills, where Lisa is talking to her mother about surviving this attack. And I was like, oh my gosh, it was just like such a wild, like emotional thing for me. It was like my two loves coming together. I don't know what that says about my brain, but like my two loves, serial killers and housewives. I really should have my brain studied. When I die, I probably will leave my body to science, because people are going to have to wear like radioactive suits to, dissect my brain, but whatever, I digress. And I know, I'm sorry if you find that horrifying. I have dark humor, and that's just how I cope. So please don't judge me. But so here I am watching this, and I was like, okay, well, I have to cover this on my podcast. So here we go. I'm going to tell you a little bit about the details of the situation, what happened to Lois, and it's just a really fascinating story. So the trailside killer, his name was David Carpenter. He is an American serial killer. And so, by the way, I'm going to, at the top of this, I'm going to put in all my notes, but there is a trigger warning here, because not only was he a serial killer, he was also a serial sexual offender, serial rapist known for stalking, murdering, and engaging in I don't know how much I can say on YouTube, but just engaging in behaviors post-mortem that were very concerning. So he was known for stalking and murdering a variety of people, seemingly no rhyme or reason, some men, some women, some couples, on hiking trails in state parks near San Francisco, California. So to be specific, it was in Marin County, California. And Marin County is right outside of San Francisco. And specifically, all of these murders happened on the Mount Tam hiking trails between 1979 and 1981. But Lois was his first victim in 1960, which is so fascinating to me. And by the way, one of the places I've always wanted to go but have never been is San Francisco, because I live so far away. Like, I live on the polar opposite end of the East Coast, and so I've just never gone. But Mount Tam is like one of the most sought after, beautiful natural trails in the world. And so I just wanted to preface that to say, like, this wasn't just some random trail that like people were being killed on. This was like a hugely sought out, people travel to that area to go to Mount Tam. It's like a very sacred, beautiful area. And so I feel like that's really important. So in 1960, Lois, so her married name is Rinna. So Lois married Lisa's dad, and their last name was Rinna, which is why Lisa's last name is Rinna. But Lois's maiden name was De Andrade. It's Deandrade. De Andrade. I'm Italian, but I'm probably mispronouncing that completely. But so in 1960, Lois ended up working in the same agency where this person, David Carpenter, was delivering mail. Now, because this was early in his career of being a serial killer, he hadn't killed anyone yet. He was still managing to mask well enough. He got married. So he had a wife, and he had just had a baby. And so Lois, because she worked in the same agency as he did, she knew he and his wife, who had just had a baby, and she was like familiar with them. His wife would come into the office. I think they had gotten together on multiple occasions. And so one day, Lois was waiting at the bus stop, and he was driving past, and he stops, and he says, "Hey, do you want to ride? You can get in the car. I'll drive you to where you want to go." And she said, "No, I got to go to work. I'm going to be late." And he said, No, come see the new baby. My wife is home. Come see the new baby, and I'll drive you to work. And I promise you won't be late. And she, of course, is like, okay, because she's like, I know this man, right? I know you. I know your wife. Like, who on earth would think that someone you work with, someone you know, is just going to murder you, right? So that was the thing I had always wondered, like, how did this happen? Because, Lois is a really smart person. She's really super self-aware. But what I talked about in an episode, I don't remember what episode it was, but predators and people with psychopathology are better at being a predator than you are at keeping yourself safe. They're so good at it. They're good at masking. They're good at pretending to be like an all-American person, and especially white men. I do have some statistics on serial killers because it is pretty much white men, right? And so unfortunately, societally, we've been taught to be concerned about the wrong stuff. And so white, nondescript, kind of beige looking men have been able to get away with murder because they know how to mask, and they know how to be involved in their community, and they get married, and they have children, and they do all of this stuff to be the average person, and people somehow manage to look past it, despite the fact that it's like, I don't know, it's just so wild to me. So he picks her up, she gets in the car, he pretends to be lost and drives into the woods, obviously purposefully, because he knew what he was going to do to her. So he drives into the woods, pretends to be lost. And so where he's driving, and this is very important, he's driving to, it's called the Presidio, which is a military base in the San Francisco area. And this becomes important to the story later. So he pretends to get lost. And then she says, suddenly he got very quiet, and he had a very intense look on his face. And this is what you'll find when you listen to any person who survived a serial killer. And by the way, there is a whole thing on this called I Survived a Serial Killer. I forget what channel it's on, but if you just Google that, I Survived a Serial Killer, it's like a People magazine exclusive show about people who have survived these serial killers. And what they'll tell you is that it's like Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde for real. Like, they will go from being warm, friendly, whatever, to instantly, like, it's like a reptile where their eyes shift completely. Like, they close their eyes and they open them, and it's like a totally different person, which to me is fascinating because it shows the pathology, the psychopathology of people who do things like this. So what happened was, she tried to get out. He drug her back in the car. He pulled out ropes, knives, and a hammer from the glove compartment. And this broke my heart. She said, "You're my friend. What's wrong with you?" And he said, "I've got this quirk. I've got to have sex." Okay. So I'm going to come back to addressing this in just a minute, because it's not about sex. It's about power control and sexual sadism, which I'm going to talk a little bit about. So this man, David Carpenter, literally is hit. So he gets Lois on the ground. He is hitting her on the head with a hammer. He is hammering her on the head. He's stabbing her as well. And an officer, a military police officer, sees what's happening and shows up, gets out of the car, and this David person is literally just furiously attacking Lois while this police officer is approaching. So David Carpenter gets off of Lois. He has some sort of weapon. It's not a gun per se. It's like a BB gun. I don't know exactly what it was, but he shoots at the cop and then misses. Or I think he hits the cop, but it wasn't like a fatal wound. And then the military police officer returns fire and hits him. So this military police officer truly saved Lois's life, truly. And here's the thing. I need people to understand how severe this attack was, because it wasn't just like the military police officer comes and she gets up and she's like, oh, thank God. No. Lois had to have reconstructive facial surgery, multiple brain operations. She had metal plates in her head. And as a result, as an adult, she had lost her sense of smell completely, had physiological impacts for the rest of her life after this attack. She was extremely lucky to be alive. She still could have even not survived this. That's how severe these wounds and this attack was. So because she survived and was able to tell her story, and because, this military police officer was able to intervene in time, she survived and was able to get him convicted. Okay, so this is what's wild. She was able to get him charged with assault and kidnapping on a military base, the Presidio. So this is why this was such a big deal. Because it happened on a military base, there were more strict rules and regulations and laws and things like that. But here's what's wild. He only served like 8 years in prison, and he was released in April of 1969. His wife divorced him, and he learned not to leave any victims after this. And he didn't. He went on. I'm just going to name the rest of the victims because I just feel it's important to honor them. Because again, he is a nondescript beige white man. By the way, he had a very severe stutter. And he was bald and he was unfortunate looking. And so people felt bad for him when they really shouldn't have. And he convinced a therapist or an assessor or whoever it was at the time, he convinced them that he was cured. And what we now know about psychopathology and sexual sadism and all of that, he would probably not have gotten out today, but this was during a time where there was very little known about serial murder and sexual sadism and all this stuff. And so he's released in 1969 and he goes on to murder so many more victims. So he murdered Richard Stowers, Cynthia Moreland, Shauna May, Diane O'Connell, Ann Alderson, Ellen Hansen, and Stephen Hurdle. But Stephen was the only other person aside from Lois to survive. And eventually that is how he ended up getting caught again. Also Heather Skaggs. So those are the murders that he was convicted of. He was also suspected of the murders, which he clearly did. Etta Kane in 1979 and Barbara Schwartz 7 months later in 1980. The reason he couldn't be caught on that is because he used a different weapon, and so they just couldn't link him to that. Because again, let's remember, DNA and forensics was not what it is now. So those were the first two that he killed, and then he was never charged for those. And it was also confirmed recently by new updated DNA evidence that he also was responsible for the murder of Mary Frances Bennett. And so the last victim that he ended up trying to kill but survived, Stephen Hurdle, was able to, testify, let everybody know what happened. And so David Carpenter is actually still in jail. He's still alive. He's old and he's still on jail. He's on death row. He overall just had when you look at this guy's history, it's just crazy to me that he was just able to continually be let out and just whatever. He committed sexual offenses when he was 14. When he was 17, he was charged with child molestation. And then after released in 1969, here's the crazy thing. He had a parole officer who was interviewed on the show who said he was a good parolee. He said and this is why I kept saying this. He said that he was a nondescript beige guy with a stutter, and nobody ever suspected him, despite the fact that he had this wild history of sexual offenses and violence against not just women, people. It's just wild to me what people will ignore based on how somebody looks. It's just where was people's intuition? I don't know. It's just so crazy to me. So the last thing that I'm going to say about this is that I find so fascinating. It's something called the butterfly effect. And the butterfly effect rests on the notion that the world is deeply interconnected, that one small occurrence can influence a much larger complex system. The effect is named after an allegory for chaos theory, and it evokes the idea that a small butterfly flapping its wings could hypothetically cause a typhoon in the future. And so this attack with Lois happened a few years before Lisa was born. No joke, a few years. So if Lois was killed and never survived this attack, she would not have been, he would have been caught anyway because there was a police officer there, but Lisa Rinna never would have been here. And if Lisa Rinna never would have been here, who would have brought up Munchausen Gate on Real Housewives of Beverly Hills? I'm being snarky, of course, because the one major reason I have issues with Lisa Rinna is because of how she treated Yolanda, during the whole Lyme disease thing. And as someone with a chronic illness, it just always just really irritated the crap out of me, that whole thing. But in all sincerity, could we imagine a world without Rinna? Could we imagine a Housewives where Rinna was never there? It is just, there's this intersection between Bravo and serial killers, but also philosophical, just interesting worlds where there easily could have been a world where Lisa wasn't here, and then who would Harry Hamlin have married? And I don't know, it's just wild to me to think about. So the last thing I'm going to say, I'm going to talk a little bit about serial killer stats. So just in case anyone is listening, if you're interested, there's this, it's called an encyclopedia of modern serial killers. It's called Hunting Humans. And so there's a couple of stats that I just wanted to give. The racial breakdown of American serial killers is 82% white, 15% Black, and 2.5% Hispanic. Estimates of the percentage of female serial killers vary, but because there aren't a lot of studies on it, but the estimates online are anywhere from 8.6% to 17%. That's kind of a wild swing. And I do want to explain that the motives are often psychological with strong sadomasochistic overtones and evidence of compulsive behavior. So I'm going to explain sadomasochism is a term to describe deriving pleasure of a sexual nature from the infliction of physical or psychological pain on another person or on oneself or both. So this term is like a portmanteau of sadism, which means deriving pleasure from inflicting pain, and masochism, which is deriving pleasure in receiving pain. So the terms that you may have heard are S&M. Rihanna has the song S-S-S-N-M-M. Okay, but you get it. So I have to make something really clear, though. There is consensual sadomasochism that should not be confused with acts of sexual aggression or violence. So consensual sadomasochism is just like, there's a dynamic where there's someone who wants to be dominant, someone who wants to be submissive, but it's consensual. We're not hurting anybody. That's not what we're talking about. These types of people who enjoy this, they're not going out they abhor uninvited aggression or abuse. So generally speaking, sadomasochists are not psychopaths. In fact, they're the opposite. However, people who have psychopathology and sadomasochism, that is where all of this comes in. And listen, I could do a whole other episode on that, and maybe I will. If you're interested in me talking more about the psychology of serial killers, I literally have studied it my whole life, which maybe one day I'll, give a little bit of insight into my personal experience with that. But I'm going to leave this here for now. So thank you all so much for listening. I hope that you've enjoyed. Now, I will just say next week is going to be the season finale of Your Bish Therapist podcast. Excuse me, season 2. Your girl needs a little breaky break, and I'm going to take one. So I've got a lot of things to deal with and circle back about regarding my health and things like that. So here's what you can expect. Next week is the season finale of Your Bish Therapist podcast season 2, where I will be covering wherein. For those who are listening in Scotland, I apologize for how atrocious that accent was, but I'm going to be covering Baby Reindeer. It's going to be very, very intense. It's going to be a very long episode. But for people who didn't watch Baby Reindeer or don't want to hear that, or it's too intense for them, I'm also going to release another episode just thanking you all for just your unending love, support, loyalty, dedication. I'm so grateful for you all. And I just want to say thank you. So I'm going to do an episode to thank you. I'm going to share what you can look forward to with the future of Your Bish Therapist, because I am planning on bringing you some really great things. I can't wait to grow. I just can't wait to see what this all becomes. I feel like we're on a rocket ship up, all of us together, and I'm so happy to be here with you all. So for now, I'm going to say, take care of yourselves and each other. And I can't wait to bring you more YBT. Disclaimer, posts are not intended to diagnose, treat, or provide medical advice. Your Bish Therapist is for entertainment and informational purposes only. The podcast, my opinions, and my posts are my own and are not associated with past or present employers, any organizations, Bravo TV, Greyheart Productions, or any other television network. The information in YBT podcast and on its social media is provided for general informational purposes only and is not intended to diagnose or treat. Please do not act or refrain from acting based on anything you read, see, or hear on YBT podcast or associated social media. Communicating with YBT via email and or social media does not form a therapeutic alliance. Melissa, operator of YBT, is unable to provide any therapeutic advice, treatment, or feedback.